The Global Fragility Act aims to transform not only the nature of US government assistance and support to these countries, but it aims to do so by transforming the nature of the state and society relationship in these countries. It's a huge, huge task. So a lot of thinking about accountability here is about thinking about how to actually alter the structure of how the US government thinks about accountability so that it can begin to advance toward this difficult task. So I'm going to build on the paper that Sarah Rose, Dan Honig, and I wrote, and I also wrote another paper called Implementing the Global Fragility Act from Policy to Strategy, which was published by Mercy Corps, and I'll pull a lot on what's in there as well. So I'm going to try in just a few minutes to actually outline some of the key things that an accountability framework needs to actually pay attention to. And first, I want to set out 3 problems, right? The basic problem that we're dealing with here is that the international aid has a broken feedback loop between the producer of the good and the consumer. In any normal good, the consumer of the good gets to vote by buying or deciding not to buy the good, gets to vote on the quality of the good. In international aid, the quality of the good is decided on by the producer. The consumer is left out of the picture. And of course, the consumer is both the fragile, conflict-affected state and the actual people who you're aiming to support, serve, help, enable through this process. So this is the fundamental structural problem of all international aid. And everything that we're talking about today attempts to address that problem in one way or another, but it's not a problem that will ever be solved. 2, the particular nature of aid to fragile and conflict-affected countries faces the challenge that the aid industry was based on state-to-state cooperation. That's how development cooperation started. That's how certainly security cooperation operates. That is not what you're trying to do in fragile and conflict-affected states. What you are trying to do is alter the way that the state behaves with society, which means you can't just wholesale buy into what the state is doing. Second, all of your outcomes are dependent on actions by other actors. This is fundamental because it means that you're not delivering a good yourself. It means you are delivering a process, an enabling capacity, a support structure, some logistical support, some infrastructure support that will only work when others decide to use it in a particular way. So the process of buy-in, accountability, feedback is absolutely essential in all international aid, but particularly in these contexts where you are trying to transform the nature of the state-society relationship in a complex, highly politicized, changing context. Okay, so what do you do? And what do you do in the GFA in trying to actually set up some kind of framework? The first thing that you do is you detach accountability. You break accountability up into kind of 3 buckets. You realize that accountability has a compliance function, right? Complying to actually ensure that the money is spent in a way that Congress believes is the right way. It also has a strategic function, that the strategies, the ideas, the focus that you set at headquarters should shape and determine what is done at the field. Third, accountability has a performance function. That accountability, which fundamentally means that you give a set of actors the authority to judge whether something is working or not, right? So those consumers are able to judge whether it's working or not. Accountability, that type of accountability facilitates performance because it gives you feedback about when things are going well and when they're not going well. And you need that type of feedback, that real-time feedback, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected contexts where you may not know exactly what you're doing because you're trying to actually transform another state and society, and it's highly contextualized. So you need to learn what's actually going on and where things are changing. So in actually thinking about how to divide this up, what I'm going to put forward are a few different ideas about how to develop an accountability framework to serve these 3 functions: the compliance function, the strategic function, and the fundamental accountability function, which is accountability to local and national stakeholders in conflict affected countries. In terms of thinking about the strategic function, the GFA calls for metrics. If you develop very detailed metrics at DC and you try to get all the countries to comply with those metrics, you will inhibit them from learning and adapting and getting buy-in at the local context. And so when thinking about what you are developing in terms of metrics for reporting in DC, I think it makes, and this is what Sarah, Dan, and I write, that it makes a lot of sense to focus on large, strategic, aggregated metrics. You know, these are the 5 things that we want to support, and make them kind of process focused. So what is the nature of the state and society relationship that you want to facilitate? How are you going to know when the projects and programs that are being implemented are actually facilitating those? So rather than thinking about metrics at DC monitoring exactly what's happening, think about those as allowing you to aggregate what's happening, right? Secondarily, when you're looking at trying to facilitate an adaptation and learning process and risk taking, which is what this work requires, risk taking not only of people who live in these contexts, but risk taking of the actual US government staff and implementing partners. When you're trying to facilitate that, you also want to monitor that. So the 2 things that you want to really focus on monitoring at the country level are broad strategic level aims, goals, and broad indicators. 2, whether people are learning and adapting. Because right now the system is structured that people are rewarded for implementing exactly what they planned on implementing, which implicitly means that they won't learn and adapt. So once you begin to do that, you set the strategy and the focus so that country offices can then, within that framework, or missions and partners within that framework, can actually begin to develop something that allows them to learn and monitor what's happening at the country level and to contextualize everything. So how do you do that? There are kind of 2 things I want to focus on. One is that the US government has been plagued by kind of the bunker syndrome. As over my fieldwork over and over, it's the US government staff and partners who are most often constrained in their nice buildings behind high walls, and they don't actually have the relationships necessary to learn, adapt, or even figure out exactly what needs to happen. So you need to enable, support, and encourage staff and partners to spend time building relationships with the diversity of actors within the society that they need to work with. That's hugely important. And that means giving them time and space to do that, so they're not just always focused on delivery, delivery, delivery. But it also means enabling them to kind of take risks and learn and innovate based on what they're learning. So that's about a permission that you can give to people at the country level. Second is developing this broader process that I really talk about in both my book and these 2 pieces of local accountability, which means that essentially you develop a broad consultative process with local stakeholders who represents the diversity of ethnic, religious, and social groups within the society, and you enable them to give you regular feedback about what's going on. That is your monitoring and accountability at the country office level, based on your specific indicators and what you are trying to establish at the country office. That local accountability process then can be translated into your broader DC-based indicators, but it requires a broader translation process. And finally, I think it's quite important to bring Congress into this process, that you really enable and educate Congress throughout this entire process about what it looks like to establish this local relationship, to actually take risks in these environments. So I'm going to stop it right there, and we can open it up for discussion.